Welcome to the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast. Habits, routines, motivations, and mindsets from some of the most successful real estate professionals among us. Check out the show notes at connectpracticetrackgrow.com. This show is brought to you by the strategic resource for real estate professionals, creating and coaching business opportunities and strategies that support and add value to the lives of real estate professionals at thestrategicresource.com, and by Roost Real Estate Company. Today's real estate agent doesn't follow old rules. She makes new ones. Learn more at careerwithroost.com.
Hi, all. Chris McAllister here with the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast, where it's my job to make your business better and your life, hopefully, much easier. I'm here today with my podcast partner and digital marketing specialist, Laci and I want to welcome you to part 5 and the conclusion of our deep dive into the long-term ramifications of the recent civil court decision in the case of Stitzer Burnett versus the National Association of Realtors and assorted brokerages. So just a quick recap. In part 1, we covered the facts of the case and got a basic understanding of what this verdict did to our profession as a whole in the short term. And in the second part, we talked about how the 4 mega brokerages involved, RE/MAX, Anywhere, Keller Williams, and Home Services of America, responded to the lawsuit and why. And if you'll remember, RE/MAX and Anywhere chose to settle, and Keller Williams and Home Services chose to fight on, along with NAR. In part 3, we talked about how we as broker owners, in my opinion, to a large degree, brought this on ourselves and what we can do in the future to restore honor to our profession. I know that sounds a little melodramatic, but I do think it's a bit on the nose there. And in part 4 that we did last week, we covered some of the practical changes that we're going to have to embrace regardless of how the appeal process plays out in 2024. And today's episode is entitled Guessing and Betting on the Next 25 Years. So Laci, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm great. I appreciate that recap because we've covered a lot. Guessing and betting on the next 25 years. That's some title. How'd you come up with that? Why did we title this episode with that?
Well, I've been a strategic coach client since I think 2003, 2004. And the founder of Strategic Coach, Dan Sullivan, is just a brilliant thinker and resource to entrepreneurs. And Dan came up with this concept earlier this year that everything we do as entrepreneurs involves guessing and betting. So we first make guesses about what we think is going to happen in the future. And then we place bets on the guesses we think have the best chance of that we have the best chance of being right about, right? So when you think about what we've talked about the last 5 sessions we've done together, we're doing a heck of a lot of betting, right? We're forecasting, we're making predictions, we're prognosticating, but we're guessing. And this episode is pretty much done guessing. And this episode is about which guesses I think that we should be willing to place bets on, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I have had the luxury of, not a client, but I've been Dan Sullivan adjacent for many years. And, that's a concept that I think I use every day. I guess about the day and then bet on what I'm going to be able to accomplish each and every day. So it absolutely makes sense.
And the second part of the title comes from Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. Bezos famously said that his focus as CEO, back when he was running the company on a day-to-day basis, he wasn't focused on the things that weren't going to change in his time frame over the next 10 years. What he wanted to do was to anchor his thinking to what he knew he could count on no matter what. So what Jeff Bezos did, and I assume still does, is his entire day, his strategy, his thinking was all informed about the things he was confident weren't going to change at all over the next 10 years. And I just want to take that out a little bit longer, right? I think there are certain things that we're guessing that I'm willing to bet will not change over the next 25 years. So we can react to the things that, we think are going to change and affect us in the short term, or we can create a personal business for ourselves that is built on a solid foundation, a rock solid foundation of things that just flat out are never going to change, right? Does that make sense? So, for instance, we know that home, right? Home will always be the most important thing to all of us. That's never going to change, right? And after we came out of COVID, it's more important than ever. It's where we raise our kids. It's where we get entertained. It's where we have our restaurants. It's where we do our work. I mean, it's everything. And I'm willing to bet my entire working life on that outcome, that home is going to continue to be the most important place in our lives. So my goal today
I'm willing to bet your entire working life on that as well. Just want to put that out there.
And my goal today is not only make some guesses about the future, but figure out which are the safest bets for the next 25 years. So before we get rolling into that, I have a couple of updates about the suit itself. So first of all, there's a podcast out there called All In, ALLIN, the All In podcast. And it's for successful venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs get together every single week and talk about what's happening in the industry. They talk about AI, they talk about politics, they talk about so many things. And I was surprised when I was listening this past weekend that this lawsuit came up and the four of them spent a good 15, 20 minutes on the topic. And their perspective was very transactional. I mean, these guys are the elite of the 1%. And, they were focused on the fact that, why should I pay a realtor $60,000 for something that, I could do myself? So for them, it was all about commissions and all about the price fixing aspect of it, less about the service because they really had no need for the service. When they did transact properties, they had an attorney draw up the contract. They did the negotiations themselves. They had an attorney draw up the contract and do the closing. But I think it's interesting that this thing has started to enter the zeitgeist, so to speak, that, I'm hearing more and more about it. And what was super interesting yesterday, there was an article in the New York Times, 12/27/23, and by Deborah Kamen. And it's a long article. Gosh, it's 2,000 words actually, about what's happening with the National Association of Realtors. And I had no idea. So aside from the suit, I guess there were all sorts of scandals among the leadership ranks in NAR this past year. So they had a president who had resigned under the weight of sexual harassment allegations and wrote an open letter to the NAR. I didn't see this, read it, but I don't pay attention to these things. And anyway, the convention was coming up, and there was a fear amongst the NAR staffers that this guy was going to crash the convention. So it's a little salacious, a little drama there, but there's some weird things that are also going on with the leadership, I guess. And so, this reporter is saying that the year delivered a 1-2 punch of dual scandals. One was, of course, the lawsuit. And the other was the fact that they actually had 3 people who resigned in the top leadership positions, and one of them was involved in a sexual harassment scandal. So a 1-2 punch, and many within the organization actually admit, and this I think is interesting because I have not seen these words anywhere, but NAR is now in real danger of going under. And when you think about it, if they lose this appeal, we're talking billions of dollars. And if they lose this appeal, the likelihood of losing the other lawsuits that we talked about last week is, fairly great as well. And, bankruptcy is a real possibility for NAR, I guess. And then the other thing that was interesting about this article is that several high-profile real estate agents across the country are talking about starting their own realtor groups or their own groups. Realtors own the term realtor. So if NAR goes under, there'll be a mass fight to own that trademark, I guess. But there's already talk in the industry that I hadn't paid any attention to or even been aware of that, some people want to create an alternative or multiple alternatives to NAR. They also talk about in this article the additional lawsuits, again, the specter of the bankruptcy word, more about the antitrust things, and the fact that, again, RE/MAX and Coldwell Banker stopped requiring their agents to join NAR. And Redfin actually which is a national company, will require agents in certain markets to stop paying NAR altogether. So now we're getting to the point where it's not optional to join NAR. You've got some companies saying that they don't want to be associated with NAR at all because they never want to be drug into these lawsuits. So, we've heard the words going under, we've heard bankruptcy. Here's my favorite. This is an extinction level event. A real estate agent with Compass, who has been one of the most outspoken critics of NAR since the sexual harassment allegations broke. So they had 3 people leave, starting with the president, Kenny Parcell, the president. He quit in August. And then Bob Goldberg, the organization's longtime chief executive, the guy who actually runs the day-to-day, he bailed out a year early on his contract. And then they had a human resources person who had been in position for 40 years. And she finally resigned after facing widespread calls for her removal. And again, that probably stems from the harassment allegations. Anyway, what else? I'm flipping through this article again. I read through it again this morning just to be ready. But
I think this might be a good time to mention correlation and causation, right? Because all of this stuff is happening at the same time. But, and, one doesn't necessarily cause the other, but the correlation is really important, I think, and the timing.
Yeah, the timing.
I don't know. This is not something we've discussed up to this point. The outside possibility, right, that the NAR is going to go away. It's kind of all been, will the NAR go away because of this? But we haven't really discussed the fact that this is not the only reason the NAR could go away, right? And the fact that this happened before this, maybe, and people have already been thinking about how they're going to.
I think you're exactly. I think that is a great point. I don't believe NAR is going to go under because of harassment charges. I think if NAR were to go under, it would be because of the weight of the lawsuits and the pending fines. I also found it interesting that this article being published the day before, we plan to do this podcast together where I am going to make my guesses as to the future of NAR for whatever that's worth. So there was this, you talk about a confluence of events, coincidence, I guess, huh? So NAR itself, get this, has $1 billion in assets. They control $1 billion in assets, this Realtor Association, right? And they control access to the MLSs. And as we've talked about, it's not every MLS, and the Times doesn't go into this, but we know that there are certain states where they have already passed legislation that you don't have to be a realtor to get into the MLS. But that's one of the big things that, people are furious about with NAR is the fact that only realtors get to go in the multiple listing service, and it's very hard to sell a house without the multiple listing service. Now, notwithstanding that, you can do it for sale by owner on Zillow and a million other ways to do it. But nevertheless, that's one of the big criticisms of the group. They are one of the top political action committees in the country, raising more than $80 million for both Democratic and Republican political candidates in the 22 election cycle alone. So they spent $80 million on different candidates in the 22 election cycle. And again, this is going to go to appeal. They're not backing down. But again, it all comes back to, and especially in this article, and I think what's become clear is it comes down to whether or not they can keep the MLS restricted behind what they call a velvet. So,
we didn't talk about any of this in none of this was the subject of the lawsuit, but the more you're talking about how they control access to the MLS, I keep thinking like this is, and they're all of their assets. And I keep thinking this is starting to sound more and more antitrusty.
I know. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the more you talk, the more I'm like, well, maybe they missed something.
Yeah. Well, there's another giant lawsuit coming down the pike, and it's not just the big four that are being included this time. This time it includes eXp, World Holdings, Compass, and Redfin. So it's understood why Redfin in certain markets has decided to disassociate from the realtors. So this could be a very disruptive event, as we've talked about. You and I are trying to anticipate what could happen and get ahead of it. Especially at Roost is what we want to get ahead of it. But this article really does make it real. And clearly, with all these people that they talk about in this article, it's 3-4 people that are trying to create alternatives to NAR. The only thing I can say to that, Laci, there's obviously big money in trade organizations. So I guess if you can get dues from as many people as you could possibly get dues from and restrict the use of the word trademark, I guess you could make a ton of money. But I do think it's interesting that people see the Realtor Association as a giant business model and they want to get in on that middleman stuff. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. It sort of is I don't know, it's an amplifier and maybe a capper to this whole series, I think. And like I said, it was published in the New York Times yesterday, the 27th. If you want to take a look at it, it's a little bit more salacious, but it's also clearly critical of the National Association of Realtors.
Well, I think the fact that there are more of these articles coming out and they're going into more detail and they're incorporating, parts of the story that are not directly related to the lawsuit. What I see that as, especially from a marketing perspective, is, people are going to start to hear about this. They're going to start to look into this. They're going to start to, and real estate agents specifically, and they're going to start to do their own thinking and their own guessing and their own betting. I think the really great thing about Roost is how almost all of your strategy and your tactics you're betting on the things that won't change ever.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think you're already ahead of the game, because everything that we talked about with the NAR, all of that focuses on what might change, right? Not what's necessarily going to stay the same.
Stay the same. Yeah. And we have to be aware of what's going to change. We can't keep our heads in the sand, but I think that long-term business is going to be here in the next 25 years. You've got to focus on the things that aren't going to change, the things that people have always wanted and will continue to want. So what I wanted to jump into today was and I headed this section of my notes as the National Association of Realtors has become a de facto labor union for we agents. So we've established NAR is a powerful force in the industry. It's got a huge impact on the lives of its members. It is a trade association, but I'm not the first person to compare it to a union because it shares a lot of the same characteristics. So both NAR and, a trade union or a labor union are membership organizations that represent the interests of their members. And I think you could substitute workers, right? We all have to work for a living, and we all pay NAR for the privilege of using the word Realtor, access to the MLS, the status associated with that extra level of training, et cetera. But, and it's not that much different than, an auto worker paying the Teamsters. Obviously, the difference is auto workers are W-2 folks and we're not, but nevertheless, we pay NAR to represent our interests as real estate agents and brokers, right? Now, obviously, the Teamsters don't represent workers in a particular industry. They represent workers in all industries or many industries. But at the end of the day, we pay them to look after us, to take care of us, to have our best interests at heart and have the skills, resources, and access to influence government, right? To pass laws that are in our best interest. That's what it is. So both NAR and trade unions engage in this. This is extreme. It's not that the NAR, although this is what the lawsuit is, Laci, it's not that the NAR is engaging in collective bargaining on our behalf like a union is. And yet, if it's the NAR that's negotiating contracts with MLSs, right, on behalf of their members, it's a little bit of a stretch, but you could make that analogy. Just like trade unions negotiate contracts with employers, NAR negotiates, and I think you have to include the state organizations and even the local, but they negotiate contracts on our behalf with the MLSs, set the rules. There's also various benefits. NAR, gives us education and training opportunities to take advantage of, all for an additional fee, of course. They give us legal and legislative advocacy through the Realtor Political Action Committee or RPAC. And, just like AARP, we get discounts every 5 minutes via text message, for discounts on insurance and all kinds of other services. So if trade unions are focused on collective bargaining and political activism, NAR is focused on providing services and also political activism, or at least political influence. So it is interesting because, as I think about this the last few days, we have abdicated literally our entire business model. All of us have, to NAR. When you really go to the deep bottom of that rabbit hole, it's hard to say that, clearly we've been complicit, right? I mean, we've been relying on NAR, paying NAR for a long time. I think it's a safe thing to say that they got a little bit greedy clearly it's in their best interest to have as many licensees become realtors as possible because it's a numbers game. And maybe this confluence of events, very well could be a tipping point. So
I think that's interesting when I think about it, is it a union? Or I think about, like my sister-in-law is a member of the union. She works out in LA as a writer for TV and movies, and she's a member of the union. And I think my question for you is, if I'm looking for someone to help me buy or sell, right, a home, then I'm looking for a realtor. I'm looking for a trademark, registered trademark, little R with the circle, realtor to help me do that, because I don't know, just in my mind, that's the most trustworthy and reliable of, like, everybody else is like an off-brand real estate agent.
But are you?
Is that the same?
But are you? Right?
No, not in reality, but just in my mind, right?
But that's the sale, right? That's how NAR ourselves is, that if you don't have that realtor trademark beside your name, that people aren't going to trust you. And the scary thing is that feels like it's starting to change. I mean, let's face it, if you're looking for a realtor, well, first of all, you're going to go see Nana. But,
right.
If you didn't have Nana in your family, you would talk to somebody who recently bought and sold a house, ask them about this experience, ask them if they would refer anybody, right? You would probably assume they have a license, because most people don't practice real estate without a license. It's a felony. But my guess is you'd probably be looking at them, looking at the brokerage. But I don't know that any of us would dig so deep down to see if they actually had that realtor button next to their name. It's not something that we tend to flash around.
But with the control, right, that the NAR has had over like the MLS or, where I am, then there are some very practical aspects of being a realtor versus not being.
Right? Absolutely are. What I'm saying is, you and I being so close to the business, know to ask those questions. I'm not sure that if you had a fantastic agent who wasn't a realtor, that's going to stop that agent from getting business. That may have been different 20 years ago, but I don't think that's the future.
That was my question. Is that real, or is it real or not real?
I don't think it's real. I think it used to be, but I don't think I'm betting, well, I'm guessing right now, that's not going to be the case anymore going. So as NAR's ability to attract members and support from the big guys like RE/MAX and Anywhere and so forth, its relevance is only going to diminish over time. It's going to become less and less of a force to be reckoned with. And I think the best example or analogy is the National Rifle Association. Remember, they used to be, my God, that's all you ever heard about was NRA this and NRA that, and the giant political action folks, and they almost went bankrupt. And I assume they're still out there, but they're not top of mind or big in the media anymore. And of course, NAR has a vested interest in having as many members as possible. It is a body shop and a numbers game for them. And the fact is, this is interesting, right? So this has always been my criticism of the giant, legacy house brokerages and, the mega franchises, is that it's a numbers game for them, right? They need as many people as they possibly can to be able to collect, fees from, right? And if you get to the point where you're not adding agents to get those base fees, then you're not growing as a company. And if you've gotten so big that you've become a public company and you're not growing anymore and your profits are going down, your stock price goes down, and, everything sort of diminishes after that. NAR is no different. There's a reason why they want as many members as they can get. But I think that as we go forward, and let's say there is commission compression, but the other thing that's going to happen is, I don't think you're going to see, and I'm willing to bet this one, Laci, I don't think you're going to see as many part-time, third, fourth career realtors, socialites, dabblers, dilettantes in the world. I think this industry is about to get far more competitive, whether because, fee structures are going to finally change, or, agents are going to become more productive. But if you just pull the 30%, it'd be interesting to know exactly what percentages of realtors didn't close a house in the last year, right? But if you've got 1.5 million realtors and you lose 30% of them, it doesn't mean the business is going to change. It means that the 70% who are left are going to continue to do make very good livings. And the 30% of the people, many of whom are a danger to themselves and others, are going to disappear. That's great for the public, as far as I'm concerned, as maybe as bad as that might sound to somebody, but that's great for the public, but it is terrible for NAR. So NAR is going to be against anything that potentially reduces headcount. Right now, the way the commission system is structured and the way clear cooperation is structured, NAR can continue to collect fees from a lot of non-producing or poor producing realtors, because in many markets, you sell one or two houses a year, you've made a nice pocket full of change based on that buyer broker agreement or that clear cooperation agreement. And it's way more than enough to take a piece of that out and pay the NAR. So, anything that's going to reduce headcount hurts NAR. I still think, and where I think, here's a guess, I'm not willing to bet on it, but I think what you're going to see, it's not just NAR, in my opinion, that could be in trouble. I think the individual MLS are going to be in trouble too. So it's like, for instance, where we are in Columbus, we have Columbus, Ohio. You go down I-70 to the west about 40 miles, you come to Springfield, you go another 30 miles west and you get to Dayton, Ohio. So you're talking maybe 70 miles, about the same distance from top to bottom that Brevard County, Florida is, where we are today. In that 70-mile stretch on I-70, there are 3 individual MLSs. We do business in all 3 of those. We have to pay 3 individual MLSs. We have to pay Columbus, Western Regional, which includes Springfield and Urbana, and Dayton. And then there's another one in Cincinnati. That is ridiculous. The only people making money on that are the people who own those MLS franchises. Nobody else is. And I think the thing that you're going to see is that a Zillow or even a Realtor.com, which isn't associated financially with the Realtors, by the way, they just sold them that, or they licensed them the name Realtor for Realtor.com. But I think Zillow has the makings of a national MLS platform where we as Realtors or individual sellers ultimately go out there and advertise their listed properties. For Zillow to do that, though, would be a big change to their business model. Right now, they've got a really good thing going that they don't want to see the boat rocked anytime soon either. They're a public company. They've got shareholders to answer to. But Zillow is a beautiful thing. They get all of our information for free. They get our listings for free. They aggregate leads and they turn around and they sell them back to us. It is a beautiful business model. And for that business model to change to one that is a, quote, a national per fee advertising platform probably would not be as profitable as their current model. So, Zillow, just like the NAR, is not going to go down without a fight.
All very interesting. So disruption, right, is one thing. Working with entrepreneurs that we talk a lot about is kind of purposeful disruption. So I just want to throw out there, I read a comment I just Googled NAR alternatives and I found about 1,000 Reddit feeds from basically most of them were new real estate agents who were like, do I have to do this? It seems really expensive. And one of the comments that really stuck out to me, almost everybody was like, yeah, you cannot do it, but you're just hurting yourself and your clients. That was really kind of the general gist. But there was one comment that said something like, as much as I don't like to pay fees, I really wish they were higher because the amount of, and they said clueless agents that have joined since 2020 just by passing a test and paying a minimal fee is nauseating, is the word that they use. So if I'm thinking about the NAR, you said they'll really fight against anything that would, give them fewer members, but I would go the opposite direction. I would try to, without, making anybody mad, I would try to become super exclusive. I would raise my fees. I would, make it the cream of the crop. I don't know if that's a possibility, but that's just what it was on my mind after reading that comment.
No, and I agree with you completely. Where it's not in NAR's best interest to raise fees. It's in their best interest to lower fees and attract as many new realtors as they possibly can. I think the place that we have to go to solve the problem that person on that Reddit feed is articulating is individual states have got to raise the bar on who can get a license and what continuing education is going to look like and what pre-licensing looks like. If you remember, we talked about, since COVID especially, this whole thing about watching videos of continuing ed on your computer, answering 9 questions and, being able to buzz out, a 3-hour course in an hour and a half, unless it's structured that you have to get a certain percentage and then it'll slow you down, and make you wait to answer the next question. But I'm with you 1,000%. We raised the bar, we raised the licensing fees, we raised the licensing requirements, and NAR can do what they will, but I think that comes down to individual states. And that's going to have a lot more meaningful and immediate, return on professionalism, let's say, than, we as individual brokers, trying to push back and raise our standards, which we have to do. And which is exactly what, I'm going to do with Roost going forward is our standards will be much higher than what I see in competing brokerages. And I'm not trying to save, the world. I'm not tilting at windmills, but I want an organization of professionals, of people who can consult with real estate investors, whether they be individuals or professionals, people living in their house, owner occupants or not. And I want them to be the best trained, the most productive, the most experienced, all of those things. And that's what I want this company to be about. But I don't think you're going to get that from NAR. Maybe we did get that from NAR, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But I think it's a safe thing to say that we're not getting that from NAR now. And that's part of what the issue is. So anyway, now you got me going again, but I think it starts with the licensing.
Well, so much of the disruption you see is the lowest common, you're catering to the kind of lowest common denominator, right? Or
yes.
So much of the right? That's a lot of what you see is how do we get to the most people with the, the least amount of money so that volume equals, quantity equals quality at that point. But so little of it is what you guys are doing. What I see maybe some of these replacement organizations, right, might try to do, which is really step above, right? To maybe have
But I think the problem with NAR and broker owners is we've left it to NAR to be our mission statement writers, that we've left it to them to articulate a vision. We've left it to them to create strategy and tactics. I'm done with that. I'm not going to abdicate that responsibility to NAR anymore. And I'm certainly not going to abdicate it to, any of these new middlemen startups. I absolutely believe in licensing. You'd be crazy not to, right? So you're going to always have licensing, but I think we have to go back to an entrepreneurial responsibility to ourselves, our stakeholders, our companies. And gosh, Laci, I'm saying it out loud. I think we got to cut out the middleman. And the middleman, quite frankly.
That's great news for buyers and sellers. Great for buyers and sellers.
So what happens if NAR folds or just becomes steadily more and more irrelevant? What is going to be lost? We don't have NAR. What the hell happens? Well, I do think that one of the issues is, the influence NAR has on state and even federal government legislating and rulemaking bodies. The states have followed NAR's lead for a long time, and to have them step out is going to create a vacuum. So either individual brokers have to step up and get involved at the local and really the state level, or you're going to see individual states sort of do what they do best, which is expand their bureaucracy. And that's probably not going to be the best solution, but somebody's going to step up and fill the void, right? So it's either going to be state-led government bureaucracy, or it's going to be a handful of visionary leaders like in Columbus, the Harley Rudas, the King Thompsons, the people that for Columbus, for instance, are synonymous with ethics and high standards, in real estate for, decades and decades, who are gone now, quite frankly. Either those people got to step up somebody's got to step up and be that person again. We don't have that right now. So, bureaucracy is problematic. People out for themselves are problematic. We need leadership, quite frankly, Laci. I guess that's what it comes down to. I think we're going to have brokers step up. We're going to have leaders step up. They're going to have to get involved at the state, local level. They've got to promote fair competition, transparency, consumer protection. I'm going to make that bet right here, right now. We have got to step up and lead this industry. We cannot continue to abdicate our leadership responsibilities to the NAR. All right. As we get through this series, the other thing I just want to clarify once and for all is, my position on the case for buyer's agents. Nothing just irritates me more about this whole thing than how initially the media came after buyer agents. And now we think we're starting to see a shift that people are starting to understand what NAR is doing and what has happened. And obviously from that New York Times article, NAR is becoming the villain. But buyer agents are absolutely critical. They deserve every dollar they make. Working with that buyer is, you can't automate, you can't digitize that part of the equation. You got to, let's just use first-time buyers as an example, but move-up buyers, I think, is an example. But, if you've got a first-time buyer, you can't digitize putting mom and dad at ease when it comes to the kids buying their first home, right? That relationship, that one-on-one, face-to-face, belly-to-belly interaction, not just with the kids buying. I use kids, I don't mean that disparagingly, but the people actually buying the house, but you're also dealing with the family. You're dealing with mom and dad, and you can't digitize, helping Nana, manage, expand, liquidate her personal real estate holdings, right? There's nothing about that can be digitized. You need buyer's agents for that who have the emotional intelligence to make that real. I do think, this is a guess, I've not put money on it yet, but I do think the whole distinction between what a quote listing agent does and what a selling agent does, or a buyer agent, is going to start to fade. And here's the next bet, Laci. I think real estate consulting is the term that I think we're going to see going forward. I think that's going to be the new norm.
What's the definition of real estate consulting?
Real estate consulting means that we are experts at every aspect of buying and selling real estate. It's an NAR construct that we have separated buyers and sellers and clear cooperation. And to some degree, that's been aided and abetted by agency laws. But dual agency or transaction agency is legal in every single state in the union. So to separate buying and selling, I think, is just wrong. You need those interpersonal skills, whether you're working with a seller, negotiating with a buyer, negotiating with another agent who might be involved. You're a consultant. What do I need to list my house at? What should I offer for this house, right? Those are consulting questions. Those aren't listing questions or buyer questions. And I think as we see processes start to become streamlined, I think as we start to see costs coming out of the whole equation in response to commission compression, I just think that distinction is going to fade. Just like the buyer agency function, one-on-one consulting can't be digitized. You can do it on Zoom, right? But it's not nearly as satisfying. But I'll tell you, the sad fact is, and as we talked about how we got into this to a huge degree in the first place, is we didn't even bother to meet on Zoom during COVID, right? We just sent docs via dot loop and hoped for the best. So anyway, the buyer agent function is never going to go away. The title may go away. Whatever the compensation is called may change, but let's face it, those buyer agents, the people that are, one-on-one helping people get into their first house, or those real estate consultants, right, that are helping people sell their very first house and move on to their next move-up house. That is worth money. That is valuable at every single price point. The question is, how can we make it more predictable? How can we streamline it? And how can we add value? And if that takes some costs out of the equation, so be it. Rather we be in charge of how the costs are going to be removed than somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, we can all DIY whatever we want, right? Like we can change our own oil. We can, build our own addition to our house. Anybody can do anything by themselves. But in most cases, in most situations, people choose to work with a professional. And like you said, there are varying, price points where you can do that. You can run down to the 5-minute oil change place and get your oil, bottom dollar, or you can take it over to here. We've got a place called Aiken and Black, which is where all the, high end cars end up for all of their service. And it's just a kind of a known fact. So, we can all do it ourselves theoretically, but most people choose not to. And that's not going to change. I think obviously you're spot on with that.
So I do think that there are ways to automate, systemize, make more predictable the list side of the equation. And we sort of dug into this last time, but one of the problems I see, having thought about this for the past few weeks of the current real estate model, is that there are so many individual practitioners out there that you can't count on anything being the same there's no standardized experience from one seller or to the next or one agent to the next. And that's because of the nature of the independent contractor arrangement with the brokerage. I think it's also a result of, pressure to have as many, quote, realtors in the mix as we could possibly get. It's almost like we've let the processes expand to accommodate the number of people who hold licenses. And I think some bright young man or woman is going to dig into that and figure that out sooner rather than later. How do you make that experience on the list side more predictable, more valuable, guaranteed outcomes, I guess is really what we're looking for. So
will it be an algorithm or will it be a highly niche, specialized kind of person? Like, which way will that go, right? That's my main question about it, is will it be, it'll likely be some version of both options, but. Yeah,
it's going to be way more involved than sticking a sign in the yard and waiting for somebody else to sell the house. Let's put it that way, right? It means that.
Yeah, are we going to rely on Bard or are we going to rely on RENA in the Space Coast, right? Like and again, I think it'll be both. Some people will prefer to rely on Bard and Google's AI, and some people will prefer to rely on RENA.
I think that's true too, but right now we have so many people who put a sign in the yard. They're not really adding value beyond, signing a listing contract and putting it in the MLS, and they're asking for, 3% or whatever it is in that market, and then another 3% to pay whoever brings the buyer. And that person who sticks the sign in the yard more often than not has no intentions of ever bringing the buyer because, they don't want to get involved in, quote, dual agency. Why would you pay 3% for that and then put all of the onus on the buyer agent to get the deal done? It's wrong. So I have a lot of ideas that we're going to get into over the year. I don't want to give them all away here today, but I think there is a concept called I don't have a good term for this, but the certified pre-owned home. I think there is a way to, why wouldn't you as a seller want to get a home inspection up front before the house goes on the market? So you know what you're dealing with, or, fixing what needs to be fixed, or at least go in well informed. Why wouldn't you want, a set of marketing pictures, a marketing package for your home that is yours, no matter whether the agent you hire first actually gets the job done or not, right? Why wouldn't you want a AI assisted appraisal for your home where condition, functional obsolescence, location is taken into account with a number that you can absolutely count on? If you think about, if you had those three things, right? If you knew what the house was going to appraise at when the buyer gets a mortgage, if you knew what the issues were with the house and either A, fixed them up front or were prepared to disclose and negotiate those issues up front, and if you had a marketing package that was so detailed and so complete and so, quite frankly, crystal clear and beautiful that 90% of the questions any buyer ever had would be answered, whether they found the property on Zillow or on Coldwell Banker or wherever else. Just those three items alone, Laci, think of the upstream bothers that literally are going to be eliminated, right? Whether the person who sticks the sign in the yard sells the property or whether there's a co-op involved. And we don't think about this system like that. We don't talk about it like that. We don't approach it like that. We rely, and I'm not saying that there are not fantastic listing agents that essentially do all those things and probably more, but they are few and far between compared to.
Yeah, it's not the norm.
It's not the norm. And that's one of the things that got us here in the first place. So
I think about when I bought my home and how, and I bought from family. And so a lot of the choices were ours. We did get it, obviously appraised and inspected. But like if I had known that I would or wouldn't for sure have to replace the HVAC unit 3 months after moving in, which we did. I needed, when I was thinking about how much home I wanted to buy, how much down payment I wanted to put down, every decision I made about buying my home was underlying mindset was, I want to make sure that I still have enough of my savings to cover the inevitabilities, of what's going to happen after I move in, which is a great thing that I did that because we did end up having about $15,000 of out-of-pocket expenses immediately, almost in the first year that we didn't know were going to happen. So what if you could predict that?
Right. And most buyers don't have those resources, Laci. I mean, and they don't have Nana, helping them out in their corner either. So we need to look at every aspect of the home selling / buying experience of fresh eyes. We've got to identify the bottlenecks, whether it's in the listing, marketing, negotiation, contingency, closing phases. Where are all the bottlenecks? Where's the friction, right? How do we eliminate that friction? And more importantly, remove the drama, right? Get rid of the drama, increase predictability. And as I think about that, and I think about all of the things that I do and have done for the past 20 years, that because that's just how it's done, I just feel like we're ripe for literally a wholesale transformation. And quite frankly, one of the things, and I don't know if Remax is listening or anywhere is listening, I want to believe that, one of the reasons that they have decided to walk away from NAR, aside from the legal liability, is that they want a chance to step up, identify, and remove those inefficiencies without having pressure from NAR to let things be the way they are.
Yeah, and the underlying theme there, I think, is there's one big area of friction that is not going to be possible to address with anything other than trust. And that's just the going into the process, especially when you're talking about first-time buyers, first-time sellers. That relational part of it is going to be.
Yeah. And that goes back to why, to disparage buyer's agents is just wrong. It's just not right. So market making is going to become the thing, right? Sellers hire us to sell their houses. We've talked about this before. We just talked about it again. So many listing agents stick a sign in the yard and we wait for somebody else to sign the house. I'm telling you, if I'm signing a contract with a realtor and I'm going to pay them, I don't care how much it is, I'm hiring them to sell that house. I expect them to come to the listing appointment and show me a list of potential people in their database that would be interested in a house just like mine, right? I'm hiring them to sell my house. I'm not hiring them to let somebody else do it. This isn't about agency, right? Agency law is completely different than compensation. This is about doing the job that I, as a seller, am hiring them to do. So just like buyer agent functions are never going to go away, the value of a real estate professional with hyper local market expertise and a database of potential buyers and relationships, that's where the money is, Laci, and that's going to become way more valuable than it's ever been before. And I dare say it's almost like we're going back to the future, before the internet, before Realtor.com, before MLSs, back when they had the books. That's what you got when you hired a realtor. So now that we've been through 20, 25 years of real estate explosions and, with tons and tons of agents and values going up and the internet and everything, I think it is time that there's a transformation in the industry and we take the best of what came before, the best of what happened in the past 20, 25 years, and there's a new thing coming. So my big bet is, I think this is the third big bet, is that market making is going to take on far more value. AI can help with market making, right? It can help, take data and put it together, but it can't make the phone call for you. The best way to win a listing is to honestly be able to look a seller in the eye across that kitchen table that says, I may already have a buyer for your home. Let me show you. I think that matters in the most way. I think, obviously, when you talk about all these things, listings will continue to matter. Listings are always going to be the best lead driver you could have. You put a sign up on a listing, you're going to have buyers calling you. And quite frankly, even in the age of Zillow, some people don't. They go to Zillow and then they farm out those leads. But you can't argue with the fact that a well-managed listing is the best lead driver you can have. Listings are how the best in the business get the attention of new clients. And, we've talked about this before, but we do instant open houses. We get a URL for each new address. We set up its own individual website for each listing for our agents, and that's what we promote on social media. So what happens is anybody who's interested in that house, that lead goes to the listing agent. That's how it used to be in the old days. And that's what we're trying to promote again. I'm not trying to disparage Zillow, but there's no reason for me to use my platform to promote a Zillow listing and know that those leads are getting passed out for a profit amongst X number of competing realtors in the market, right?
Zillow is like the Tinder, right? So you can see what's up there from both sides and you can swipe, one way or the other. But like, what if Tinder had a third party who was out there verifying that you weren't being catfished, verifying that their picture is what they actually look like today? I just, real estate agents are going to be the third party verification for the Tinder app of real estate.
Yeah, there is something to be said that part of what we do is to filter and find the truth in all of the things that are on the internet, including bad information on Zillow and so forth.
Well, and as AI becomes more prevalent, you can take a picture, anybody, right? I edit photos and have my entire adult life, and I'm pretty good at it. So I could go in anytime and edit a photo to make it look like whatever I want. But now anybody can do it, right? So if you take a photo of your house, you can add a filter and change things, and so and not that's something that's going to be done broadly necessarily, but it could be. So as AI becomes more prevalent, I feel like the human part of the transaction actually becomes more important, not less important. I think that's something that people maybe are worried about. The AI is going to take over everything, but it really makes the human element more important, not less important. As a writer, we've talked about this. As a writer myself, everybody's worried, well, you can write anything with AI. Well, sure, but somebody still has to go in and make sure that the information that's pulled is accurate, that it's relevant to your audience or your clientele. There's still that human element is just as important as it's ever been.
So buyers agents matter, listings matter, consultancy is the future. Here's kind of a summary, Laci, I think, of the things we've talked about in the past, today and the previous 4 episodes. So as we sort of round out this series, here's a few more guesses that I'm making about the next 25 years. So I'm guessing, and I'm willing to bet that there's going to be a shift in power dynamics. I think NAR is going to be weakened regardless of how the appeals process goes. I think that's going to lead to a change in regulations, some more flexibility, streamlined processes, and greater focus on transparency and consumer protections. I think barriers to entry for new real estate brokerages and online real estate platforms are likely to be lowered, but only in that, as we're already seeing, that you won't have to be a realtor to list on an MLS anymore. As we talked about, it's already happened in certain states. The reality is, though, that where that's happened, it really hasn't changed the economics of the industry or how much agents make. But if you don't have to be a realtor to get into the MLS, that's a big change. What's going to happen is the default barrier, as we sort of just discussed, is that state licensing law is the barrier, right? If we don't have NAR as an extra line of ethical defense, so to speak, state laws are the critical barrier. But the plus side, and this is a guess, but I think that great ideas, new ideas for businesses and so forth will get to the market far faster, and they will cost less than in years past. So that's the second bet. We're going to see new business models, and those business models are going to cost the consumer less than the legacy business models do. I think you're going to see more transparency, more consumer protection. You're going to see buyer agent agreements like we talked about before. I think consumers are going to have a better access and forced understanding of commission rates, agent qualifications, and property details. There's a lot of crap on Zillow and Realtor.com that's not policed. I've seen listings where the pictures weren't current. Like, for instance, I've seen pictures of potential rental properties or people who are selling a rental property and they want to sell to another investor, where the pictures on Zillow are pictures from when it was last rehabbed. And then you go in and show the house, and that's not the same house, right? It's certainly not the house that's represented in the pictures. There's just so many places that you've got to have, and NAR doesn't police that, right? And I'm not sure the states can police that. So to some degree, that's Zillow. But again, it comes down to the brokers and what their standards are for the agents who work for them. There's going to be an evolution of agent roles and responsibility. I think you're going to see less of a distinction between, as we just talked about, between listing and buyer functions. I think consultancy is the name of the game, and real estate experts are going to be just as well versed in working the entire transaction, not just one side or the other. I think the excuse of agency to not be a market maker with using the excuse as agency is done, gone. Anybody who continues to do that, they're going to be displaced. niches are going to matter. As they say, there's riches in the niches. As Dean Jackson says, one target market at a time. I think that people are going to become more and more valuable by going deep into a certain market, right? Whether it's us talking about farms in Champaign County, Ohio, or Space Coast condos, or, working with investors who want to buy 4 to 19 unit apartment complexes. Going deep is a guess that I'm honestly willing to bet on. I think we're going to continue to see more deterioration in continuing education and professional development. But I think as we start to shed, I think that the continuing ed that is out there and worth having will carry the day. And the continuing ed that does nothing but allow people who don't deserve to have a license keep a license, that's going to fade away. MLSs are going to continue to evolve. I don't think it makes any sense at all for us to have to pay for 3 different MLS systems within a 70-mile distance, in Ohio. That's crazy, but you've got 3 people, 3 organizations, and I don't know what the ownership structure of those is, but somebody's making a killing, and it's not us. I think you're going to see commission compression and alternative pricing models. I don't know what those are going to look like, but I have some ideas for what I want to experiment with going forward. And the other thing is, and I'm willing to bet on this, real estate agents, the best among us, will be the trusted advisors that people want and need to navigate the complexities of a transaction. And that's not going to change. So here are 5 things, right? So Laci will put this in the liner notes, but this is what you can count on. The need for local expertise. People say over and over, real estate's about location and location. That is absolutely true. And it's going to be about hyper-local expertise. Buyers and sellers will continue to seek the guidance of agents who have a deep understanding of their local markets. Relationships. Number 2, the importance of relationships. Real estate transactions are complex. They're emotionally charged. There is a lot of drama. Some of it we create, but there's always going to be drama that we have to manage, and that requires a huge degree of emotional intelligence. But building strong relationships with clients, that will remain essential for success, as we've talked about for years now. Number 3, you can bet that the focus on customer service, the actual experience, is going to become more and more important, especially in the age of online reviews and so forth. Real estate agents are service providers. Their ability to provide exceptional customer service, creating a predictable experience, will continue to be a competitive advantage and a differentiator. And that's why a huge focus that, you and I are working on, starting next month, January 1st, is, have I earned a 5-star review today? And we've been talking about, aggressively pursuing reviews, not just so that we can show a bunch of 5 stars, but so that we can actually learn something as well. But I want a cultural orientation amongst our property managers and amongst our realtors to the clients that they work with, that have I earned a 5-star review today? I think that is going to be a competitive differentiator for us. Customer service is everything, and I'm betting a lot on that new focus next year. Technology, it's going to continue to evolve. It's going to make things easier. It's continually going to make certain things cheaper, but technology is a tool. It is an amplifier. It's not a replacement for human expertise, judgment, or experience. And the 5th thing that we're going to bet on is that the regulatory environment is going to change. If NAR is out of the picture, it's going to leave a void at the state level. And we're already heavily regulated, but if NAR goes away, you can bet that regulation is going to increase. So staying up to date is the number one responsibility of all of us, brokers, owners, all licensees. But again, it's especially critical for we as broker owners, because we share far more disproportionate burden of liability and the actual investment it takes to get a brokerage up and running. So those are the 5 things that I think are huge. I think all those things, those guesses, we can count on over the next 25 years. But if I was going to summarize the 5 things that I'm betting the company on starting today, if not January 1st, a couple days from now. So for us, the focus at Roost is, number 1, have I earned a 5-star review today? Number 2, we want to sell your home for top dollar fast. That means we're going to all be market makers. For our owner clients and property management clients, how to automate your rent collection and get on with your life. Those are the three business initiatives that we are digging in specifically into the new year. The fourth thing we're going to bet on is residential real estate will continue for the next 25, 50 years to be a cornerstone of a diversified investment portfolio. Just like home is everything for everybody, residential real estate as an investment will continue to become more and more important, and we are going to double down on investments, Best with Roost, and helping our investor clients expand their portfolios. And finally, the last big bet I have of the big five is, Laci, this is the age of the new real estate professional. There's nothing that we've talked about during these 5 episodes that diminishes my enthusiasm or optimism about the future of real estate for those of us that are willing to be part of the transformation and lead the change. So this is the age of the new real estate professional. I'm betting everything I have on that.
No arguments here.
That's a lot. So
yeah, we went over a lot today. I will say one of the things that really sticks out to me, again, from a market, I think of everything from a marketing perspective, but is that niche part of it. I saw an article the other day that talked about what kids are doing these days to get into Ivy League, universities. And instead of being the most well-rounded, right, on paper, instead of taking all the AP classes and playing all the sports and doing all the extracurriculars and being involved in all these social organizations, kids are focusing on one thing. They're doing one project of significance that's actually making an impact, and that shows these Ivy League universities that they are the ones to bet on. They're the ones who are actually going to make a difference in the world, right? That's who these Ivy League universities want to admit. So one of the stats that I read said it took your chances of getting admitted to an Ivy League university from 2% as a well-rounded student with all the classes and all the extracurriculars to 75%, And that, I think that's exactly what we're going to see here. The value of an Ivy League university is not diminished because more people want in it, right? Nobody's stopping trying to get into these Ivy League universities, but the strategy is changing from being a well-rounded student to being an expert in one area. And I think that's very telling and very similar to what's going to be happening here. And in the end, I think the result is you're well-rounded anyway, right? Because all the skills and all the experience that you have to really focus in that one area is the same. It's just smarter, right? You're working smarter, not harder. So exactly. I can't wait to see how that plays out here.
You learn something from every transaction you complete. The problem is if you don't complete a lot of transactions, you don't learn a whole lot.
Right. Well, and like if you're an expert in one area, one location, one type of, that does in no way does that preclude you from going and doing the exact same thing in the next niche and the next niche and the next niche.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it's not an all or nothing. It's not a one or the other.
You have to be a well-rounded practitioner, but you have to be an absolutely specialized marketer. Right. So there's two parts to this equation, right? You've got to find somebody to work with, and then you have to be able to add value to working with them. And you can't have one without the other.
Right. They're not mutually exclusive for sure.
Right. Because you're going to have far more likely to have multiple people to work from if you focus on one target market at a time and become a specialist where you can actually make a difference and have an impact than you are if you're just tossing your, a billboard out there that says, list with me or whatever. But anyway.
Right. Well, being a brokerage that embraces that and frankly always has, I think puts Roost ahead of the curve. So it'll be an exciting place to be as all this plays out.
I hope so. So if anybody out there would like to learn more about our company, Roost Real Estate Company, you can check us out at www.realestateco.com. So thank you very much, Laci, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Chris. See you next time.
And there we have it. Thanks for listening in. If you want to continue the conversation, go to www.connectpracticetrackgrow.com. That's connectpracticetrackgrow.com, where we have additional information about the podcast, archived episodes, and an option you can select to be a guest on the show. We'd love to hear from you. So that's it. We'll be back next time with another episode of the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast.